So I'd like to thank Jen and the Friends of Giant City State Park for the invitation to speak about the Floristic Quality Analysis. So my name is Chris Benda, and I am coordinator of the rare plant monitoring program called the Plants of Concern. And this is a partnership between Southern Illinois University and the Chicago Botanic Garden. So essentially, I get to go out every day and survey for rare plants and often take volunteers along with me. And we're hoping to have these assignments for people to do annually. We can get a big data set about certain rare plant populations in Southern Illinois. But I can also be found online as the Illinois Botanizer, and I have a website, illinoisbotanizer.com. All the social media, of course, taken care of. I mainly post on Facebook and Instagram, and I have a YouTube channel. But I would like to briefly mention that on my website, I have a plant database where you can search for plants. Currently, you kind of need to know what you're looking for. I'm hoping to build in some kind of an advanced search feature at one time, but for now, I have almost 1,100 species in Illinois represented there on the website. So it's a useful tool that is a work in progress. And then I do have a number of events, workshops, presentations. I do a lot of Zoom talks. So if you want to stay informed of my events, you can subscribe on my website, and I'll send email alerts reminding people of upcoming programs or media releases and things that I may be involved in. But with the topic of today, I want to start here with the story about this gentleman. His name is Dr. Gerald Wilhelm. And he studied actually his PhD with Dr. Mullenbrock here at SIU. But before he got into plants, he did some other things, and it kind of relates, his life story relates to this topic. So he told me that he wasn't necessarily an outstanding student in high school, and nor was he really nature inclined particularly. But when he graduated, it was during the Vietnam War, and he knew he would be drafted unless he could get a deferment. So he went to community college in Florida and did well enough to continue on to the university, studied marine biology, actually. And then when he got out of the college, the war was still going on and he was drafted. But he had a college degree, at least at this point. And so they were like, okay, fill out these forms. We can figure out, what your skills are, how we can best place you here in the Army. And sort of a long story short, very interesting story short, he was sent to Vicksburg, Mississippi to work for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And they thought they were getting a hotshot scientist, and he reported for duty, and they said, okay, your first task is to go up to Lockport, Illinois. And their Army Corps of Engineers is dredging the river there, and they need to find a place to dump all the tailings, the dredge spoil. And they had passed the National Environmental Review Act 2 years previously, which said all federal projects needed to have an environmental assessment done. And so he was tasked with ranking 50 sites that had been pre-identified to determine which ones could they put the dredge spoil on and which ones maybe they should not harm. And he admittedly thought he was in over his head a little bit. He was not a botanist. He thought, how am I going to review these sites? So he went to the Morton Arboretum, and he met up with Floyd Swink and Ray Schulenberg, who were eminent botanists working in relative obscurity at the time. And he took them out to these sites. And at a lot of the sites, Ray, who was very soft-spoken, would say, there's Taraxacum officinale, there's, Andropogon virginicus, there's Ambrosia artemisiafolia, and there were weeds essentially, some native, but some European. They were just, parking lot plants, so to speak. And so he would say, don't worry, Jerry, you can spoil here. It will grow back. And then they went to what is now Lockport Prairie Nature Preserve. And at that time was just land along the river in Lockport that hadn't been substantially degraded or altered. And so they went there, and he went, oh, Muhlenbergia cuspidata. And he fell to his knees. And of course, Jerry's standing there like, huh? And he says, Andropogon, Scoparius and Echinacea pallida and Bouteloua critipendula and these names I didn't hear in these other places. They were prairie plants. They hadn't seen a true prairie yet. And he said to Jerry, "This is America. Do not spoil here. It will not grow back." And Jerry was like, epiphany in life. He wanted to know from that moment forward when he was standing in the true America versus what is essentially a European landscape with European plants that we have changed so drastically. So he came up with the idea of a coefficient of conservatism from this experience that basically said, okay, there are some plants on the landscape that I only see in intact, rich, pristine areas. And then there are other plants that are much more widespread, maybe in an old field or in your lawn or roadsides. And those would be not conservative. And so the opposite of conservative, the word I use is weeds. They're ecologically weeds. They may be native, they may not be. I realize that that's a loaded term a lot of people have different definitions of, but ecologically speaking, it's not very conservative species. So the definition here is that native species most successful in badly damaged habitats have a value closer to 0. Versus the other end of the spectrum, species virtually restricted to natural areas in Illinois get a C value of 10. So 8, 9, 10, those are the conservative species. And that comes from this book here, Taft et al., this is the Journal of the Illinois Native Plant Society, Aerugenia. This is number 15, November 1997. This has a C value in it for every single plant that occurs in Illinois that was known in 1997. So it's a little dated, but this is the published works where a lot of this information comes from. Now, Jerry also has his own book here, this giant work of science called The Plants of Chicago Region. It has its own C values. And then there's actually another one here for just Kane County. Dick Young did the vegetation of Kane County, and he has his own C values in there as well. So we have 3 resources here in Illinois. So further reading would be the Taft et al. Pub, which you can find on the Illinois Native Plant Society website, or the useful website universalfqa.org, which I will speak about in a little bit. So this coefficient of conservatism value is an assessment of ecological quality. We are assessing the landscape based on the vegetation present. So I'll give you an example. You go to Trillium Trail here at Giant City State Park, and you see wood poppies, the Stellophorus diphyllum. You don't see that yellow wildflower very many places because it's only in these pristine, undisturbed, rich habitats like the nature preserve, the natural area at Trillium Trail. White trillium there, Trillium flexipes, same thing. You don't see that around except in protected places that are intact and pristine. You can go outside in the lawn. I saw walking in this morning, Houstonia pusula is the small bluets. It's a little tiny sort of purple plant, really. That's native. It grows in a lawn. It's a 0 or maybe you could say a 1, but it's not a conservative plant, but it is native. Okay, so we're using those vegetation we see to assess the ecological quality. So here's a picture, Simpson Barrens natural area. It's a limestone glade in the woods, very high quality. Now, I want to mention that this is only for native species. Non-native species are not taken into consideration. So stiltgrass and garlic mustard are 2 pretty common non-natives in our area. In the analysis, these would get a 0. In the book, they're given an asterisk, but they're using the calculation. They would be given a 0 for each one. Now, in Illinois, it's 0 to 10 is the range. So you can have a native plant that's a 0, but I just mentioned that the non-natives also get a 0. So some of the critiques that I've seen is that the natives should start at 1 because you're counting a non-native and a weedy native as the same. And that doesn't, some people object to that. Some states actually have negative values to reflect how invasive a species is. So the stiltgrass is really invasive. So you could give a -3 to your calculation. Some states range up to 20. So there's different ranges. In Illinois right now, it's 0 to 10. 0 can be a native species. 0 is what all the non-native species get. I kind of like the negative range there, but there's lots of publications on this topic that argue for various ways of doing things. And then I wanted to mention too that there was another pub that talks about there is a relationship between C values and functional traits or life history strategies. So if a species is annual, if it's fire adapted or shade tolerant, those kind of things, those are related. They are correlated with the C values. So there's kind of some interesting science you can do with some of that information. And I want to stress that this is not a measure of rarity. It's a measure of which plants are only seen growing in pristine, intact environments. Now, a lot of times they also tend to be rare because these intact environments are rare, but they're not, this is not directly a measure of rarity, but a lot of rare plants are also conservative. So we're talking about natural areas. That means it has an intact, pristine, high quality natural community. So this is an area, it can be public or private land that was retained or recovered its original natural character, need not be completely undisturbed. It's hard to find an area that's really truly undisturbed. And it's also important to distinguish between anthropological disturbance, which is human disturbance, versus natural disturbance. For example, fire is a disturbance, and that is beneficial in some cases. In fact, to most cases, most community types in Illinois. But human disturbance, whereas maybe hydrological alteration is a big one that will negatively affect the site. So we think of these as grade A and grade B places, pristine, nearly pristine, or very high quality naturally, or high natural quality. Sort of the highest, the best places in Illinois. And so here's an example of one of these natural areas I'm referring to. This is a high quality mesic prairie. It is at Wolf Road, which is up in Cook County. And you can see their nice distribution of prairie plants. We got some prairie dock and wild quinine and blazing star and tick trefoils and rattlesnake master. So nice assemblage of plants there at Wolf Road Prairie. Now also in these calculations, they include wetness values. And essentially we want to know particularly which plants are obligate wetland plants. That means 99% of the time, the plant is going to be seen, it's going to be growing in a wetland. When you do wetland delineation, which is, important process now, we have this no net loss of wetlands. So we need to be able to go out in the landscape and say, where are the wetlands? And if we're going to mess one up, then we need to, mitigate for that. So we need to know what is a wetland. We have to define it. And one of the three characteristics for a wetland is that it contains wetland species, obligates. They only grow in wetlands. So that has a -5 is the value there. And then you can see it ranges basically the less and less percent chance that it occurs in wetland as you move down the scale. So all the way to upland, upland is basically like 99% of the time it's not occurring in a wetland, a true upland species. So all the plants get one of these wetness values, and I can tell you also information about the site. When we characterize natural communities, a lot of that is based upon soil moisture. So I mentioned a mesic prairie earlier. Mesic is moist. It's in between wet and dry. It's right in the middle. So it's xeric, dry mesic, mesic, wet, and then basically aquatic or hydric, fully saturated soils all the time. And this is American featherfoil, which is a cool little annual plant that grows in wetlands. It's an obligate wetland species. So from this information, basically, we get all kinds of interesting metrics. And I will come back to this graph here towards the end, talk about applying this. But I do want to mention that this is a great publication by Greg Spirius. Greg did his master's degree here at SIU, and he works at the Illinois Natural History Survey, Dr. Spirius now. And he has this nice review of the floristic quality assessment and critiques in defending it, and really a good primer to the whole topic. And it's all available online there, easy to read. So I want to mention some of the implications and some of the critiques, and then I'll talk about how we apply this information. So some of the implications are you need to have a pretty good handle of the vegetation that occurs at a certain site. You want to know everything that's there. You want it to be comprehensive. So if you have questionable species taxonomically, then that can be difficult. We like to think we have a pretty good understanding, of science in general and of the environment, but there's lots of revision, of course, that's constantly happening. And one is we're finding new species, and people don't always agree about this. So here's an example, Forbes saxifrage. This grows very limited places in Southern Illinois. It's at Little Grand Canyon, Panther Den. It's at Bear Branch. It's here at Giant City. This is the type locality where it was discovered here in Giant City by Stephen Forbes, named in his honor. Some authorities don't distinguish this from the much more common swamp saxifrage, which is Saxifraga pennsylvanica. Now, micranthes, see, there's a lot of name changes happening. In any event, so what you call this could depend what value gets used in your calculation. And that may not be the most, that's not the best example because they're both at C-value 10, whether you call it the swamp saxifrage or Forbes, but it could make a difference depending on what species you're talking about. Another example there are species that have been discovered as new to science or split out since 1997. So we don't have values for Carex planus bicata or Carex aureolensis because planus bicata used to be lumped in with Carex amphibula, Carex aureolensis used to be lumped in with Carex franklii. So, and these are two common species, actually. It's funny they were overlooked for so long because they're in a lot of my inventories. And when I go to enter the data, I can't put them in there because they're not in there. They were new since 97.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I've read why and how it happens that plants are reclassified, but I'm not sure I understand it. So like this used to be, this one on this side used to be in a different classification. Then what? People look at it and all of a sudden they say, oh, I see something I didn't see before.
Yes.
So then how do they decide what classification it goes into after they decide it shouldn't be where it's at?
Well, so taxonomy is kind of a thing of its own and is not my area of specialty. So I don't know always specifically of what decisions made to say, well, how is this a full species and not a variety, or how different does it have to be really different? There are justifications for that. A lot of it is looking at the tree of life, so how it fits in with other similar species. Sometimes they use DNA, so we're actually looking at the gene of that help. So there's a variety of ways that you can look at it. We call this morphology. So the form of the plant, just looking at it and saying it looks different. That's one level of one reasoning for making something different. We have to read the paper because you have to publish it and say, this is what I found and this is my reasoning, and then it's peer reviewed and published, so people agree with that. But not always. Sometimes, if you write a flora book, you can say, nah, I don't think that's good science. I don't agree with it, and you can not accept it. So there's no one true standard, and that's part of the confusion too. Is like, where's the one place I go to find out all the names? Well, it's not that straightforward. But you're right, there is justification. Somebody did look at this and say, this looks different. We're calling this all the same, but some of these are different. I'm gonna describe it and I'm gonna say it's something else.
And enough people have to agree to change the classification. Might be still some disagreements.
Yes. Well, see, ideally it's published in a peer-reviewed journal, so the reviewers have agreed with the publisher, our author, but there's ways around that too. Sometimes there's one reviewer and they're in cahoots or they're buddies, We definitely have a problem of the experts given a lot more leniency to just say things and you say, oh, well, so-and-so says this is different. So there it is. Well, what's the evidence? We really want to look at the evidence. And honestly, I will tell you, for me to read a paper, a lot of that evidence is over my head. I'm just not that tuned in with the reasoning. So I say so-and-so says it is good enough for me. So lots of implications with the species. Also, is it truly native or not? We mostly know, but not in every case. This just came up. I'm the monitor administrator on Illinois Botany on Facebook. We just had this discussion a few days ago. Eastern hemlock is at Starved Rock. People wonder if it's truly native there or not, the very edge of its range. Some say no. I think that's a prevailing opinion, but it's not straightforward. So that's going to depend if it could be a 0 or a 10 if you consider it a conservative native plant, which it would be in this case. Shortleaf pine is another example. It grows natively in Southern Illinois, only at Piney Creek Ravine and LaRue Pine Hills, but it's been widely planted. The pines in the Cheyenne National Forest are loblolly and shortleaf pine. So if you see it outside of those two places, it's clearly introduced. It should have a 0, but it's given a 10 because natively it is conservative only in these two intact places. And then the same thing for blue sage. Blue sage is rare in Southern Illinois. It's native. It's used widely in prairie restorations, and people plant them in their yard or whatever. So you could have this in a prairie in, say the northern part of the state, and it may not actually be native there. So that'll make a big difference in your calculation. Not a big difference. It'll make a difference, but it won't make a big difference because if you get a lot of species, that variation is going to get normalized if you just have 200 or more examples. So obviously this all relies on the ability to identify plants well. You're going to a site, say it's a small prairie, it's the size of this room or twice the size of this room. You want to be able to go through there and identify everything that's there. And yeah, ideally you would be able to make several trips throughout the season, but sometimes you just have one day, one visit to look. So you really need to be able to identify all the vegetation there. And often it's vegetative characters. There are no flowers, no reproductive parts. Plants are typically classified based on their flowers. So it's tough without them, but you learn clues. And if you do a lot of sampling like I've done, then you get to learn a lot of tricks about identifying plants at all stages of growth. Then also, it depends which numbers you use. So in Illinois, we're actually fortunate that we have 3 sets of values. Some states don't have any, but it originated from Illinois. So it's not surprising that we have this variation. So ideally, you want to use the numbers that are localized for your region. So if you're in the Chicago region, you want to use Chicago region values. If you're outside of Chicago region, you only have the state book to rely on. But something growing in Winnebago County versus Jackson County could be very different in their conservatism, but that's the best we have, one list for the whole state. And then we can see, so some examples of the implications of this. Downy brome, this is a common plant, common grass. It's in all the woodlands. I would give it like a 3 maybe. And in Illinois, oh, look, Illinois does give it a 3, but up in Chicago region, it's a 10. And Kane County doesn't even list it in their flora. Another example here is tall thistle. I would say tall thistle is moderately conservative overall. I'd put it in the middle at a 5 maybe. So Illinois gives it a 3 overall. Seems a little low to me, but up in Chicago region, an 8, or in King County, a 6. So you see how the numbers can change depending on where you are. Now it goes the other way too. There are plants that are more common to the north, less conservative, and more conservative in Southern Illinois, like tall boneset, Eupatorium altissimum. In Illinois overall, they give it a 2. In the Chicago region, a 0, and Kane County, a 1. Now, overall in Illinois, I suppose a 2 may be applicable, but in Southern Illinois, this only grows in high quality limestone glades. I don't see it on the roadside. I don't see it in old fields. So I would give it a much higher level of C value. Horsetail milkweed is another good example. You go to Chicago region, you go drive the interstates, the median can be covered, just filled with horsetail milkweed, Asclepias verticillata. They give it a 2 overall in Illinois. Chicago region, a 1, Kane County, a 2. In Southern Illinois, I'd give this plant more like a 7. I really only see it in high quality hill prairies and limestone glades. So the more localized you can have your set of values, the better they're going to be. But all we have for outside the Chicago region is one book for the whole state. So you see the implications there of that. Now, this graph from Spireus's paper shows what states have C values published. So you can see a lot of them do out west. I don't know how they're doing things, but you can see mostly in the Midwest and out east, we have at least one list, or sometimes there's multiple lists that have been published. So that's useful to see where it's being used. And lastly, relating to animals. So we don't typically give C values to animals because they're mobile. And you can't go to an area and classify it based on the animals there because they may not be there that day. They may not have got there yet. They may not live in that particular spot. But I would argue that in some cases we can. Like Blanding's turtles, this is a species that I studied actually for graduate school, and we would see them cross roads and go into a lawn and nest. So they're clearly not conservative in that sense. They're using whatever, was formerly prairie there probably. But they are only found in larger intact areas that are a combination of uplands and wetlands. So we don't have a lot of these matrix, we're like a snapping turtle will grow in your pond in your backyard and live its whole life there and be happy, or like a red-eared slider. But the Blanding's turtle, no, they're more particular to particular kind of habitat. And then prairie cicadas is another example. You won't see prairie cicadas outside of a prairie. And that's one way you are in a true prairie is prairie cicadas. I think you can make the argument for birds. I mean, birds are flying around all the time, but you're only going to get prairie species of birds nesting in true prairies. And if you don't have that, you're going to say, well, this looks like a prairie and talks like a prairie, but where are the prairie birds? So it's not functioning as a prairie. So I think there is an argument to be made for consideration of animals that are present. But as long as you have native plants somewhere, something's going to be utilizing it, often a variety of insects. So we want native plants on the landscape. So now some of the critiques of this. It's just a circular argument. We're saying that a plant is conservative because it grows in a high quality area, and the area is high quality because it has conservative plants in it. And that's sort of unavoidable in this case. I think that's a good critique and something that is just a reality of the situation. I still think it's useful. Another critique is that the values are subjective. So there's a range from 0 to 10. How did this get determined? A bunch of smart people got a room together who had a lot of experience and they hashed it out. I think it's a 3, I think it's a 5, and then they arm wrestle and then, they come up with the numbers. So the numbers are subjective to some sense, but I did an experiment with a friend once and he said he would call it a name and I'd say, I give it a 6. He said, I would have said 5. And we were like one off a lot of the time. So it's like, well, is it really that subjective? That's why you get a lot of people involved. Also, like I mentioned earlier, if you have a lot of species on your list, it'll normalize that variation to some extent. So it's true, but still useful. And this is the butterfly milkweed. It was saying how in Chicagoland, there's not a lot of places for this to occur. So it's considered more conservative in that region. Where down here, this grows on the roadside. This is all along interstates in the middle of the summer. It's not conservative. So where you are used to working and seeing things will affect your bias. If you're working on a statewide list and you're from a particular region, then that may influence the numbers that you would want to give to it. Also, political boundaries are artificial, right? So we do a lot of things based on the state or the county that we're in. These are totally made up lines. They have no ecological reality. We should really be classifying things based on the province, the physiographic province, or the natural division, or it depends on what level of separation you want to use, but the landform type. We have the coastal plain area of Southern Illinois. We have the Ozarks over by LaRue Pine Hills. We have the Greater Shawnee Hills. We have the Great Plains. So we should really be making values and thinking about plants based on the landscape where they occur. Okay. And then, but FQA overall, at least in my opinion and many others, it is useful. There's a lot of collective wisdom involved and it's better than guessing. We need a tool. It's a metric. It's one thing to use. It's not the holy grail. It's just one metric to make an argument about a particular piece of land. So here's the experts here. This is the nerd photo, botany nerd photo I like to get with all the best botanists in Illinois. We got Andrew Hipp, Dr. Mullenbrock there in the middle, Randy Nybor, Paul Markham. Okay, and then another critique is that it doesn't take abundance into question. So that's kind of true. I think there's a way to adjust for that. But basically, we look at this beautiful scene. This is Synandra hispidula, which does occur at Giant City State Park. It's very rare in Illinois. And there's a lot of it in this picture. So if you were making a list of this area, you would write Synandra and it would get entered once. This whole distribution gets one C value. It's probably a 10. Because only in intact areas. So it doesn't really take into account if there's one plant there or if there's 800 plants there. So that's something to keep in mind. All right, so I'm moving to the last phase here of the talk. how do we do this? What do we apply here? So collecting data in the field, that's Travis Neal, field assistant, and he's standing in a clump of Galactia Molenbrachii, and he's using his phone here. It's amazing. We have these little computers in our pocket all the time. I remember how happy I was. I got a digital camera for the first time, and then now everyone's got a camera. But in any event, we use our phones in the field a lot. So I have a navigation tab, and I like to use the Topo Maps app. It costs $7.99, I think, but it was one-time fee, and you have to load the Topo Maps, the quad maps, to your phone, but you can lay tracks and points. So the middle picture is a survey that I did many days, and you can see all the points of interest and then all the places where I walked. So that's really nice. And then with the Plants of Concern program, we actually have an app to collect data on rare plants specifically. So if you find a population of rare plants, you want to enter that in, we have a whole phone app where you can take GPS points with your phone, and the species associates are auto-populated. When you start to type them in, it fills them in, so you don't have to write out the whole name. It's really kind of slick. So we have all these digital resources to use to make this really easy. Here's another picture. This is a large survey I did for the Forest Service. You can see all the tracks and all the flags, and you can use different color flags, different colored tracks, different days you were there, however you want to do things. You can export all this and bring it into GIS. So not too different of a map, but once you bring it into GIS, you can add layers, you can add aerial imagery, you can do all these cool things. So you can see all the rare plant points in the orange, and then the tracks come in as points, and you can convert them to lines. They'll connect them in the end, but I didn't do that for this picture. But you can see how you can bring the data in, and then you can even make what I call a PDF map you can use for Avenza. Avenza is a free app. If you have a map that's been made with the spatial referencing software, then you can make the map with whatever custom made layers you want on it, load it to your phone, and when you're in the field, it'll show you where you are on that map, your custom map, which is particularly useful for boundaries. So I made this map here of a site we went to. I've kind of blocked out the rare plant info, but you can see where we parked. We walked in, we recorded points where we saw rare plants. Somebody could put this map on their phone, retrace our steps. You can see the Shawnee National Forest boundary there. So you will want to know out in the field when you're near any private land. So it's really useful too to make these Avenza maps for use in the field for navigation. All right, so then I have this 2-page forest species list. It's not all strictly forest species, but most of the habitats we are in have a lot of, are mostly forests, I guess. So these are the most common plants that we encounter. So I don't have to write down all the names. It's also a great way to learn and remember the botanical names by using botanical names. So you can check off there what you see in the field. Notice how there's 2 lines for each one. What I like to do is put a check mark as I go through the whole site, everything I see. And then at the end of the day, with the second line, I'll put in an abundance value, whether it's common, uncommon, rare, abundant, very common. And then all that data goes into the universal FQA calculator. So it's universalfqa.org. This is an awesome website. I use it all the time for all my species lists. And this is where you can just enter in the species you see, and it'll do all the math and put all the numbers in that you want. So you log in, got to create a login. And when you start a new inventory, I want to mention that if you're in the Chicago region, you don't want to be confused. There are 3 Chicago region U.S. Army Corps of Engineer options. Typically, that's not what people are looking for. The Army Corps of Engineers has their own values. They may use those. But if you want to use the Flora of Chicago region, you got to scroll down a little bit, and you can see there with F, Flora of Chicago region 2017. So that's what you would select for Chicago region. Otherwise, you can go down to Illinois 1997. That's the publication I mentioned that has everything in it. But there's also Illinois 2020, and that is a database that I added. It's really kind of nice. Anybody can add whatever database they want. Basically, the 1997 list, for whatever reason, didn't have family names in it, and all the rushes were listed as sedges, I think. So it was annoying me making these reports and not having it accurate. So I updated that with family names. The rushes are actually rushes. There might have been a typo or two that I fixed. So it's pretty much the 1997 list updated. But we should have Illinois 2022 or 2023 if we get to it next year. We need a new updated list. But in any event, that's what you would select in the database. And then you just enter in the plants. And what's nice about this is as you start to type in the name, it'll drop down with the autofill correct names. So if there's a lot of species in a given genus, then I like to type the species name Canescens because it narrows it down. Like if there was 50 species in Rubus, you type it in and that's not helpful. There are too many. But if there's just a few in the general, like Amorpha, you might just type Amorpha. But anyway, you can get them to autofill and you add them and it'll add it to the list and you click done and it'll spit out the report and you have your conservation metrics. So one of the main things we're looking at here is the top left total mean C. So that's the average C value, everything added up and divided by however many species you had. So 4.3, that's pretty high. If you're getting 3.5, more than 3.5, especially more than 4, then it suggests that this is a high quality, intact, natural area. You can also see the FQI number, 68. So the FQI takes in the size of the area. So if you have a larger area, you're probably going to have more species. So it's just another measure to go by. And again, if you get over 40 or so, then they would say high quality. So 68 is suggesting that this is a high quality site. You can see species richness. This was a one-day inventory that we did. 250 species, that's a lot. 18 of them were non-native. You can see the percentage. You can see the species wetness value, 1.5. So 0 would be right in the middle between, really dry and really wet. So this is saying it's on the drier side of things. And we were in a sandstone canyon. And then the physiognomy is the trees and shrubs and forbs. You can see here one rush. So always, before I updated the list, rush was always 0%. And that annoyed me. That's one reason why I changed it and fixed it. There are only 23 species of rushes in Illinois. Anyway, there's not a lot. But you can see how many are annuals, perennials. They're good, always useful information. So then say going forward, the next year you do another list, or you can compare it after some management has been done. You can see how has my list changed. It gives you a sort of a metric to use to guide your restoration or whatever your goals may be for the site. Or mainly also, it will help you determine if the site should be protected or acquired. If you're working in conservation, if you're saying, oh, we have limited dollars, we want to, this county forest preserve district wants to buy more land. Well, this will target your priorities a little better as far as preserving high quality places. Okay, so I'll wrap up here. Some goals to make the FQA better in Illinois. We need more inventories. Generally, I make a species list every day I go out. Just write down everything that I see. Ideally, you would have a lot of species lists, some that are in natural areas and some that aren't. And you could use that information to guide your C values. You would say, okay, here's a prairie and here's, an old lot. What species are in common? Those aren't conservative. Which ones are not there? Those probably are conservative. So you could use a lot of this inventory data to actually guide the generation of the C values. A lot of the Molenbrock students did floristic inventories for their thesis. They would pick a site and they would go there lots of times over 2 years and catalog every single species that grows there. Now, a lot of those lists are 50 years old. So we would like to update those. Some sites haven't ever, you'd be surprised the number of sites that don't have a species list, but there's not a lot of botanists, frankly, in Illinois, or people who have time to make lists. Going somewhere one day is pretty good if you're a good botanist, but ideally, whenever I do a list for somebody, they contract me and say, I want you to make a list for my property. I say 3 visits minimum, spring, summer, fall, and ideally 5, because I want to go early summer, late summer, fall, and of course, spring. So you want to get many visits. I just mentioned this, so you get a more objective approach if we get this data. Also, we have a pretty good handle on what's happening on public land. We need access to more private land. Whenever I get an invitation to look at private land, which always varies widely in quality, I always make sure to go because I want to see, you just can't get access like you used to get on private lands to look at what's there. And so I'm doing more and more of that. And as it has been perfectly clear, I think several times through this talk, we need new C values statewide, especially Southern Illinois. We need our own Southern Illinois C values. And Southern Illinois, to me, I know a lot of people joke and say south of I-80 is Southern Illinois, or people from Springfield say I'm from Southern Illinois. Southern Illinois to me is the unglaciated counties. So it's the southernmost 11 plus Randolph, Monroe, and St. Clair. So it's southernmost and then a little few counties up to St. Louis. So that would be what the region I would define and have specific C values for that. And then also I mentioned some things are missing. Some things have been added since the list was generated. So, and some of the names have changed as well. So we need to fix the name changes. We need to add the new ones at a minimum, but ideally we get new C values for the state, a new pub, and new ones for Southern Illinois, because Illinois has so little land remaining in a pristine natural condition, 0.07%. That's that tiny little red dot out of the giant beige circle. 28,000 acres out of 36 million is considered to be high quality. So we need to be able to identify, preserve, and protect these remaining landscapes, like this beautiful scene here at Cave Creek Glade Nature Preserve. So I hope you learned a little bit about FQA and the concept and applying it to your property. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Welcome to email me, botanizer@gmail.com. Again, check out my website. I have some, I try to do 4 talks a year at Giant City. We had a little break there, COVID stuff. But I'm going to speak about rare plants and their common lookalikes, I think is in the summer. And then in December, I always do a best of nature photography where I'm out all year and I pick my best photos and kind of show them off. So my schedule's on my website, easy to access that way.
Why are people reluctant to let you come on private land?
Well, sometimes it's difficult to find out who owns the land and to get permission. So at one time, people kind of used to just go wherever and people didn't care, even though there were stories of, being shot at or wherever. Molenbrock has one. But there's, anti-government sentiment that seems to be pervasive right now. Let's see. Sometimes I've run into this where people don't understand the laws and they think they're a lot stronger than they actually are. So plants don't actually get any protection in Illinois. The landowner owns the plant. Since animals move, the state owns animals. So the state will protect animals from being killed basically, but the landowner, if he's got an endangered plant, they can destroy it. It's up to them to do whatever. So sometimes people misunderstand and think that you're going to find something on their land that's going to restrict what they might want to do, or the government might want to take it away because of this resources there. There's very limited examples of that in Illinois. It has happened. There have been sites where the state took it and said, this is so high quality, like Bellwoods. You guys know Bellwoods, and up by Olney, or Mount Carmel. That the state condemned that. They basically took it, but it's so rare and it doesn't happen anymore. And plants aren't going to get any protection. So that's not, to me, a valid, it's just not true, but a lot of people think that. I've run into that a lot. I'm afraid you're going to find something. Even people I thought were conservation friendly were running a business and they were saying, our lawyers said that we shouldn't, so things like that. Yes. And well, and I like to say, people pay me to come do this. And if I'm coming to you wanting to come on your property, I'm offering for free, or someone else is paying me to do it. And so you should jump at that chance and say, yeah, I want to know what's going on out here. So, yeah, absolutely.
I just want to mention that that's nice information. I had no idea. I just moved to Illinois about 3 months ago.
Oh.
Have a piece of property, and I just wanted to know as much as I could about natives and trying to figure out what to do with my property. So thank you for
my pleasure.
This is definitely larger than than I would have thought.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very involved, but this is definitely a useful tool of many that we can use to evaluate.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Oh, absolutely. I appreciate it.
good,
Look up online.
terrific.
There's as much information that I personally can get. It's always useful information.
Absolutely.
And some more things about natives and books and things, information that you could give us.
I have some resources on my website.